Welcome to the Resource of the Future podcast series, a podcast series by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that explores the present and the future of Canada's resource sector. Our focus spans the impact of the Fourth Industrial Revolution on the agricultural sector, the evolving relationships of Indigenous communities to the resource sector, to technologies and new business practices that will be vital to our leadership towards a low-carbon economy. Our purpose is to foster a better understanding of how our resource sector binds Canadian communities together, the challenges we face, and the opportunities before us as a nation of builders. This episode is the ultimate insider's guide to COP25 and the upcoming COP26. We meet with the ever-knowledgeable and impressive Katie Sullivan from IETA as she provides us insight both into some of the challenges that we're faced at COP25 and also what to anticipate for COP26 and what this means for the broader Canadian business community. So, to get us started, Katie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and IETA?
Thanks so much for having me, Aaron. I'm delighted to participate in this special episode of your podcast, and kudos to you and the Chamber for this important initiative, just broadly around communications to your audience. IETA has been around for over 20 years now. We're a global nonprofit industry association with around 150 members, business members, spanning the globe. So we have offices in Geneva, Brussels, London, San Francisco, Beijing, and Toronto, Canada, which is where I'm based. Our work is really engaging with stakeholders and all levels of government, subnational, national, regional, and international, to support and inform market solutions to climate change. We have numerous partners with other business groups, including the chambers globally, but also NGOs, academics, multilateral institutions like the World Bank to cooperate and really amplify efforts on the need for business and market-friendly approaches to tackle the climate challenge. So at the international level, which I know is the focus of this discussion today, IETA really forms a big part of that core hub of business observers at the international climate change negotiations. And we have actually for the last several years now hosted the on-site pavilion for businesses, also known as the Business Hub. And this is where businesses, but also others, congregate during the 2 weeks of negotiations to just track and report out on the negotiations, but also their stories, experiences, and lessons learned on climate policy, on markets, on finance and technology. The list goes on.
Wow. Thanks so much. So it's an excellent overview, and it certainly is really important work. I guess, it probably would be good because we're going to have a range of different listeners on this podcast, and some will be familiar with what COP is, and some won't be. So maybe just a really quick kind of high-level overview of COP. And I know this year there was some kind of last-minute changes as to the location, and so maybe just walk us through that.
Happy to. Right. So we'll start again at the basic higher level. So COP, it stands for the Conference of the Parties. This is the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. That was signed in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio. So what you see is for 2 packed weeks every year, the COPs are held for all parties and observers to the UNFCCC. And really just that the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the ultimate objective of that stabilization, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Okay? Then under the COP, you have 3 main plenary bodies, and they meet annually at these COPs, and they take decisions regarding the 3 major agreements within the UNFCCC, right? So COP, CMP, which is the Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and then you have the CMA. So this is the Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement. And that was, as many of your listeners know, that was adopted at COP21 in Paris. That was 2015. And that's around the long-term goals to limit global temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, peak global emissions as soon as possible, and to ultimately reduce net global emissions to zero in the second half of the century. So it's under this Paris Agreement where countries have voluntarily submitted their nationally determined contributions, or their NDCs, that contain their pledges for climate action. And most of these initial pledges, right, and you have over 190 of them, NDCs under the Paris Agreement cover the period through 2030. And in Canada's case, this is that absolute national target of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. So going forward, it's Paris, establishing 5-year cycles to report, review, assess, and renew. And when I say renew, I mean enhance these current nationally determined contributions by countries. So beyond that, right, you have permanent subsidiary bodies to the negotiations. There's 2 permanent ones, SUBSA and SBI. I won't get into the details, but they're the ones who are tasked with reviewing progress and developing technical recommendations for further implementation of the Convention of Kyoto and of the Paris Agreement. Now, the final piece is beyond those are, the negotiating structure. You have a lot of observers, right? And that's certainly the camp that, International Chamber falls into and IETA falls into, and where you see literally thousands of these accredited observers to that process. And they're participating in, again, attending some of those negotiations and tracking some of them, reporting out to their various constituencies. You have a host of official and unofficial side events, and they touch on the gamut, right, of climate change, from technology and adaptation and nature-based solutions, and the list goes on and on. And you have a bunch of different observers, right? There's the Ringos, the research observers, the Youngos, the youth observers, the Yangos, the environmental observers, and many more. And again, business with IETA, again in the chamber, we're the bingos, right? Business observers to the process. The final point is it's 2 weeks. It is slam 2 weeks, extremely busy, and there's typically between 20 to 30,000 people that attend these COPs.
That definitely sounds like a full house for sure. And again, thanks for that overview. I think that, one thing that we hear a lot of that is sort of a negotiating international climate change policy is contentious, and it's contentious for so many different reasons. Partially it comes down to kind of resource bases that each country brings to the table. Some of it even has to do, I think, with some of these historical legacies as to, ultimately which countries have industrialized first and as a result contributed to world carbon budgets, and which countries still, need that leeway or want to have that leeway to be able to industrialize themselves. And sort of that, obviously makes for a lot of different conversations taking place. So I'm kind of wondering, what were some of the major issues and items that were up for negotiation and discussion at COP25? And maybe also just to kind of put that in context too, some of our listeners might have heard a little bit about Article 6, but, in reference to that, can you elaborate as to why Article 6 is so important to global efforts to combat climate change?
I can most definitely comment on the importance and power of Article 6. But before I do, you really identified, some of the challenges spot on around, this is about the climate challenge, but it's also baked into so many other geopolitical and economic trade-related issues, right? And so it is to try to remove yourself from that broader macro context. You simply can't do it and really see appreciate, I should say, all of the key nuances and interests that are around those negotiating tables and in those halls. So, and especially as you point out, in like UN speak, common but differentiated responsibilities for the developed countries versus the developing, and then these emerging economies that are looking to, of course, play a big role in slashing climate or greenhouse gas emissions and tackle climate change, but are also in need of sustainable development and growth, like the Indias and the Chinas and the Brazils, right? Not to mention, the smaller LDCs, these least developed countries, and the SIDS, these small island nations that are really feeling the hit, right, of climate impacts today. So there's just a lot involved. And also, you can never talk about these negotiations without talking about the critical component of climate finance, right? And finance that is committed by developed countries. And I should say not just committed public money, but the commitment of finance to mobilize serious private capital in order to then channel it into these developing and emerging countries to, again, support their climate action and commitments, but while also supporting the co-benefits and sustainable development to do so. I think when you look at COP25, I should take a step back. After 2015, and, Paris was gavelled through, and where, I should say, multilateralism, or that spirit of multilateral cooperation, was there. It was really there in 2015. And without it, and a lot of the diplomacy that happened in the lead up to 2015, between countries on a bilateral basis, for instance, the U.S. and China, but also on just a regional multilateral basis. Without that spirit of cooperation, we would not have gotten the Paris Agreement, right? Fast forward to today, and I don't have to explain it to your listeners, but that spirit of multilateral, cooperation on climate and many, many other things is certainly not as alive and well as it was a few years ago. So, that also is making things more challenging and contentious around the negotiating tables, both to and through the COPs. So, 2015, Paris, gavelled through, 32-page document. It's not, massive, and it contains key articles that are related to these provisions for the Paris Agreement goals, right? And the last several years have been about parties landing on implementation agreements to the Paris Agreement. So implementation agreement, or as we call it, the rule book that will actually operationalize these key components to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And what we have seen is that at COP24, this was in Poland, in 2018, parties did actually a phenomenal job in landing on nearly all of the Paris rulebook articles, from stock taking to enhanced transparency framework to adaptation to technology. There was one article that unfortunately parties did not agree to around a rule book in 2018, and that was the Article 6, and that was the article related to markets and related to cooperation between countries in order to reach their climate goals, their NDCs, or enhance that level of ambition.
That makes a lot of sense, and thanks so much for that clarification. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened at COP25 on Article 6, and also just give us a little bit more detail about why Article 6 is so important?
Absolutely. Thanks, Aaron. So yes, because all of these other core components to the Paris Rulebook were decided in 2018, the one outstanding major issue was landing on a rulebook for Article 6 in Madrid last year. And for reasons, we can get into later, but unfortunately that was not landed. But it's important for your listeners to really understand, Article 6. And it's very easy, certainly in our space, to get into the weeds around this article. It can be, again, quite complicated in some areas and contentious. But at the highest level, Article 6 is the framing of cooperation, right? I said it earlier, this cooperation in implementing NDCs between countries, right? So to allow for that higher ambition to promote the environmental integrity and to promote sustainable development. So if you look at 6.2 within Article 6, this is simply the accounting provisions, right? Think of it as more about the bottom up. So it's the approaches where countries that use market, right, and trading by using what we call ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, towards their NDC are given guidance for the robust accounting of those ITMOs as they go across those borders, right, those national borders, just making sure that there are clear accounting provisions for countries to ensure there's no double counting when these units are being used. So for instance, in the Canadian context, see how Quebec is linked currently with a cap and trade system to California's cap and trade system. So you have these transferable units, these trading units, allowances and offsets that are going across the Canada-US border. So really having clarity around 6.2 in accounting makes sure that as, in this example, a Canada and a US are reporting to the UN on their NDCs that there is no double counting of those units and reductions. And then there's 6.4, and I'll just be brief, but that is the top-down mechanism. So it would establish a new UN governed mechanism to reduce greenhouse gases and support sustainable development. So the issuance of units and ITMOs for any countries, not just developing, but developed and developing countries to use in order to help reach their NDCs. So that's how the easiest way to kind of parse out at a high level Article 6. And I know, it's so important to recognize the value and the power of an Article 6 in these markets. And again, just for context, when you look at the current, these are just the initial NDCs that countries put forward, through 2015, you have around 100 countries, including Canada, that identified that they would need markets and cooperation, right, international cooperation to reach their NDCs, or if they had access to these markets and to these trading mechanisms that could enhance their NDC, right? In order to actually quantify, because it was important for IETA to actually quantify the value, that potential value of a sound, robust Article 6, we partnered with the University of Maryland and using the Global Climate Assessment Model, looked at all NDCs in the world. And what we found is that if NDCs were to go it alone, countries were to go it alone just within their borders, right, to reach their NDCs, versus if they were allowed to cooperate, right, through trading with other countries, that you could see through economic efficiencies, right, through access to lower cost options, through the driving of scaled financing outside of borders, right, or inside borders, we found that it could unlock $320 billion US dollars a year by 2030. Okay? And then my final point is we looked at if you were to take that money, the cost savings that are allowed for, enabled through trading, right, that it could unlock around 9 gigatons or 9 billion tons of enhanced ambition. So additional mitigation a year by 2030. So that, again, in more quantified, measurable, tangible in some ways terms, right, helps to actually highlight the real critical role for these markets, and, the important role to have an Article 6 rulebook going forward.
Katie, thanks so much for that overview. I think it sounds really clear that the stakes have never really been higher to actually find a resolution for Article 6. And I think on that point, the way the media kind of reported it and sort of the way that people looked at it, it kind of seems that, COP25 didn't meet these objectives, or at the very least was quite inconclusive. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. COP25, we were, and it wasn't just the business community, but certainly the business, and I believe actually, a shout out to your sister organization, the International Chamber of Commerce, who created these buttons that maybe you and some of your viewers had seen or maybe even wore in Madrid that said, all I want for Christmas is Article 6. And you had hundreds of these people wearing buttons, all I want for Christmas is Article 6. And there was a lot of, I think, positive momentum heading in to Madrid, that something would be achieved. I think that over the course of the negotiations, for various reasons, there was still definitely progress that was made, but then you could start seeing things fall apart around some core components to the negotiations around Article And I mean, I have to say, going to your question, like, was COP as abysmal as, many of the media were reporting out? There wasn't a lot of high expectation, right, for this COP, to be fair. Because you had already, or the international community had already landed on a lot of those core components to the rule book, as I said earlier, in Poland, right? So there was there were a couple of these bigger issues, one on loss and damage, and then Article 6. So that became a focus of the negotiations. But, and there were some other light, I would say, core outcomes that, there was a Chile Madrid time for action. This is more soft language around ambition. There was some agreement on the longer term goal, right? There was agreed to on the scope of the second review. But, I think it's also important. There's a lot happening, not, again, part of that core form of the negotiations piece, right? But on the margins, there was a lot of, buzzworthy things that some people, certainly again, mainstream media in Canada might not have noticed. And, Santiago call for action on 4th, this whole buzz and action and attention now being paid to nature-based solutions, right? Natural climate solutions. There was a Santiago plan on finance. So that was the first time you had 51 finance ministers, and they were all committing to mainstreaming climate considerations into financial decisions. The higher level ambition alliance, so these blocks started to grow in numbers. And I have to say a shout out to U.S. state level and the Canadian provinces, the subnationals, and also cities, right, were extremely well showcased with lots of attention and also leadership announcements. But yes, sadly, Article 6 was not achieved in Madrid. So now it's eyes on Glasgow.
So I guess that's really the question here is, on the one hand, was there anything that really surprised you about the negotiating process in Madrid? And I know that the expectations seem to be mixed, but was there anything in particular that really did seem to come out of left field that changed the direction of the conversation? And I suppose as a follow-up to that, what are the real expectations about landing on an Article 6 rulebook in Glasgow at COP26?
So very, very good questions. And in Madrid, I think there was all, again, certainly across our community, and I mean, we had worked so closely with other groups, whether it was EDF or C3S, and just negotiators, right, and looking at a lot of the work at the intersessionals, right, and beyond the intersessionals with heads of delegation and just technically with the negotiators through 2019, right, before we even landed in Madrid. And so there was a lot of, promise around some elements of Article 6 that there's progress made. And like I said, I think on 6.2, this is more that the bottom up, the accounting provisions of Article 6, that there is a lot of consensus there. And there, I think, again, in negotiating speak, as there's still draft text, right? Negotiating text, you have lots of brackets, right? Lots of brackets, and then you pare down the number of brackets as it becomes more and more of a final, document and then hopefully adopted by parties. So, the Article 6.2 on the accounting, I think we're only down to around 2 brackets for that component of Article 6, which is quite good. Now, those brackets, they are challenging, and, it is around how to define corresponding adjustments. And I will save your readers, your listeners from, again, too much of the gory or detailed items around, corresponding adjustments, but it is vital. And, around ITMO transfers and then how to treat these transfers from outside, for instance, outside of a scope of an NDC. What if there are some ITMOs, right, that are not currently in the NDC, a country's NDC, who, how is it then accounted for, and accounting for even non-NDC use of ITMOs. And this is, through, for instance, the International Civil Aviation Organization. They are launching their international sectoral offsetting program soon. And so how then would the accounting look like if you have airlines that are purchasing some of these reduction units from a Brazil or a Mexico? So, there are some really core elements that just have not been finalized yet because there are certain countries that are taking different stances. And I will say that I think in some ways there was some foresight around what some of the positions were by certain countries heading into Madrid. But in other ways, I think there were a few surprises that came, I would say, first week and like heading into the second week that took a few off guard. And I just don't think there was any kind of returning back or getting things back on the rails, frankly. The other piece I will say, which is really quite challenging, is the treatment of pre-2020 units. So these are units issued under the Kyoto Protocol, right? So AAUs and CDM, so Clean Development Mechanism, the certified emission reductions under the CDM. So those were all issued pre-2020, right? So some countries are sitting on quite a number of these Kyoto units pre-2020. So how are they treated, if at all, right, allowed to then be used in a Paris Agreement context post-2020? And so there's a lot of still some challenges that really need to be overcome on the treatment of pre-2020 units.
Well, that's a really fulsome overview. Thanks so much. And I think, we look at the world, the momentum that was behind the Paris Accords and the Paris Agreement, and that kind of ability to sort of think towards global cooperation. I think increasingly people feel like we're moving more towards a multipolar world, and there's a lot of competing interests, and I think it seems at least it's getting harder to find these points of consensus. And so just to take this, perspective, what is going to be the case, or what will be the implications if we aren't able to achieve an ultimate Paris rulebook? And bringing that closer to home, what are the implications for Canada's energy sector in a world where Article 6 goes unnegotiated?
Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic question, Aaron. Again, myself and the team and a lot of our fellow travelers get asked that a lot these days, as you can imagine. Because, first of all, there is a very real possibility that we will not get a Paris rulebook in Glasgow this year, at the end of this year, right? But does that mean then game over, right, for markets? No. It also, a really, really critical piece that is more, I guess, quietly understood is that in Article 13 of the Paris Rulebook, keeping in mind now we do have a rulebook for Article 13. It's only Article 6 we don't have one for. This is a transparency and reporting article. So that was adopted. And there's a hook in that article, okay? We call it the hook for markets, where this outlines basic elements of a transparency framework, right, for countries reporting, again, to the UN on their NDCs. It describes the actual information required to track and progress the implementation and achieving these NDCs. It also includes a section on market accounting, all right? So it is this, it's the hook provision. It is there. It's a section that, countries that are using these cooperative approaches, that they just have to be able to account for those properly, and it has to be consistent with Article 6. That's what the actual text says. Now, it doesn't mean that it is that without an Article 6 rulebook, that countries can't still use these cooperative approaches in order to reach their NDCs, or I guess report on progress, let's say, towards their NDCs. So there is something baked in there, right? That is very, very important and does provide some of that, guidance, rulebook guidance for these markets and cooperative approaches. Now, how we are, again, more broadly, around like just the path forward and, thinking through, well, first of all, we do know that work will continue, right? Article 6 rulebook. I will say a lot of the technical stuff, we've had like the technical negotiators around the world, the markets negotiators have been working tirelessly on the technical elements. So in many ways, this year it's critical that a lot more of the diplomacy, higher level engagement with decision makers, like government decision makers, around, again, the power of Article 6, what it means, to countries reaching their NDCs or enhancing that ambition or driving major private capital into their borders, right? But it is more that higher level diplomacy engagement that will be really, really critical through Glasgow. And we do know, like, the iterations, so the latest text, draft text for Article 6, with the brackets now, that will be the basis going forward, right? It is not stopping Article 6 pilots right now. So ITMO pilots, these trading, clubs and pilots from moving ahead in the real world. Okay. So, and some of those countries, will use the current draft of at least the 6.2 accounting. Even though, like I said, there are a couple of still bracketed pieces in that, but some countries will move ahead using that as the foundational kind of signal or roadmap for their guidance on ITMOs and pilots. And so, the piece, a big takeaway, the role for this bilateral cooperation and these clubs, it's moving ahead, right? And again, I go to the example of Quebec and California. They have a linked cap and trade market, right? They have a linked cap and trade system. Not having an Article 6 rule book coming out of Glasgow doesn't then suddenly mean poof, right, to this currently linked market. And you see a lot of these other examples. So it just likely means that you're going to have these hopefully high environmentally, integrity, clubs and coalitions of these carbon market players that emerge. And for Canada, I think Canada is already taking quasi-leadership role in helping to, support these other non-UN but complementary to the UN process market type of clubs and collaborative, activities, and maybe hopefully down the line, more tangible pilots, ITMO pilots. I think, on the final piece around, Canada, if anybody has looked at some of our the modeling work, whether it's that Enviroeconomics has done or, a host of other modelers in looking at reaching our current 2030 target and how challenging that will be, let alone the net zero targets that we are likely going to be announcing, over the coming maybe even months, that there's just simply no way that in an economically, again, efficient, pragmatic manner, that we are going to be able to reach those targets without some kind of international cooperation that is, required, again, through 2030 and certainly beyond when we talk net zero. And that obviously has a direct impact on, businesses in the energy sector and many of the chamber members and my members in this country. Because without access to those lower cost reduction opportunities, again, outside of our borders, it will just mean that the cost of, compliance and helping Canada achieve its NDCs will look a lot more different and a lot more, costly and be a lot more challenging.
Okay, thanks so much for that insight. That's a wealth of information. I think a lot of our listeners will be really interested to hear that. I think kind of on that point, because this is certainly something that the Chamber is advocating on. We've had a position on effective climate policy since 2008. Carbon pricing has been a component of that for us with some very specific principles. And a lot of those principles ultimately come down to the fact that, we want to identify pathways that are going to be the most effective and also the least costly. I think that's, it's really key for us to be able to identify these good tracks. And so I think, obviously these international trading opportunities and offset opportunities are going to be a key component of that. I suppose I've got two questions for you. On the one hand, we kind of covered off, I think you sort of pointed out that there's a lot of opportunities still at play, even if Article 6 remains, unratified or even, can't get to a final agreement on COP. I suppose the question there, though, are there some sunnier spots? Where are some areas where parties and non-parties could make progress? And, in addition to that, I think this is really key, is how business, in particular, how can Canadian business and beyond play a role in this process?
Fantastic questions again, Aaron. Thank you. And I look at, again, Madrid. It was a very odd COP. Let's also give a shout out to the Chilean government and the Spanish government that within a month managed to actually, due to the unfortunate protests down in Santiago, where it had been planned for the entire 2019 until November of last year, but within a month managed to do an outstanding job just even logistically in getting 25,000-30,000 people and everything, on the margins of these COPs from Santiago to Madrid. And they really, they pulled it off. But again, they pulled it off again, logistics wise. They did a fantastic job. But Article 6 was, because there wasn't as much other meteor stuff, right, to cover. This is a different COP though, right? So, this is, the year that, it's 2020 and it's the start of the Paris Agreement, right? And it's the dawn of a new era, and you have Glasgow, so the UK is the host. And I will say that, not knocking, all the hard work and, that the Chilean presidency did and the diplomatic efforts in the lead up to the last COP, but, you do have a lot of seasoned, climate diplomats in the UK that I know will be working very, very hard across a number of elements to just Paris Agreement, COP, the spirit of cooperation as we head closer and closer to Glasgow. And also it is going to be a bigger, dare I say, like a sexier COP, right? And because you are going to see, we are expecting to see a lot of countries, right? We'll see whether or not it's Canada, but a lot of countries that land before Glasgow, with enhanced NDCs, right? Current NDCs. So what are these countries going to do in order to actually enhance? Because we all know that the current NDCs are not going to get us anywhere to where we need to go by, 2030 and beyond based on the science, right? So enhanced NDCs for the current, and then also net zero, right? So a lot of, the mid-century, longer-term 2050 net zero commitments that they'll be showcasing. You'll have a lot of attention paid to enhanced NDCs by countries. Again, this will happen likely through even New York Climate Week and as we head close to Glasgow, but also these net zero commitments, right, that countries are going to be making through the next several months. So there will be a lot of attention paid to that, right? There's also, I suspect, a lot of attention that will be paid to finance, right? Because if you look at current commitments by developed countries, again, including Canada, it was a commitment by developed countries to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance to developing countries going towards mitigation and adaptation. Well, 2020 is here. And so re-upping, right, and getting more clarity on these future climate finance commitments will be important. Also that role of private sector and really how to mobilize the private capital, that financing, to help reach, these very ambitious goals and finance-wise. So that's going to be top of mind. And also having Mark Carney, Canadian Mark Carney, now as the key special envoy, and just his background with the Bank of Canada, TCFD, a lot of just the financial community and mainstreaming these climate considerations into financial decision-making, that is very likely going to be quite a hot topic and really important to watch again in Glasgow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for that overview. I think this has all been excellent information and certainly given us, I think, a wealth of insight into the process. I think, looking ahead to COP26, if you were to have the opportunity to advise key decision makers on how to navigate it, how to achieve meaningful progress on negotiations, and to operationalize Article 6 ultimately, what would you tell them?
Well, I can definitely answer that because that's what we're doing. And we are telling a lot of, again, different groups, engaging a lot of different groups, and of influencers, I should say, not just government, but, influencers across borders, right, and sectors, be it big business in Brazil, right, or environmental groups in Europe, and then, yes, certainly in government, in all capitals around, again, the real need to provide this support and the guidance and that kind of clarity around the runway and consistency for how these international markets could be used and employed and the accounting done properly going forward, right? And not having an Article 6 doesn't prevent countries from cooperating using markets to reach their climate goals. But having an Article 6, a clear Article 6 for all countries, and not just countries, but also businesses, to have that clear, consistent, universal guidance will just make sure that we can use these markets and by both facilitating and just accelerating how these markets can be used for, again, the cost savings piece, but enhancing this ambition down the line. So, I mentioned earlier about the modeling work we're doing because there's something about having the numbers, right? Looking at these numbers, both in cost savings, but also in enhanced mitigation that could be unlocked through these markets. And so we are, using that, tailoring some of that to various regions, right? And then different audiences and governments to really make it clear that, there could be a lot at risk if they don't find some kind of safe ground and consensus on when the window presents itself at COP to land on a workable, good Article 6 rulebook.
Well, okay, I've really appreciated this conversation. There's no question that it was our privilege to be able to kind of invite you on this podcast, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you and to learn from you. It is certainly clear that there are no shortage of challenges ahead, but that the opportunities are also great. The Canadian Chamber plans to be at COP26, and so I look forward to working with you there.
Thank you so much again, Aaron, really for inviting me to this special podcast. And I certainly hope that you're in Glasgow with us, but also some of your members. So I guess my final point is that if you haven't, to your listeners, given thought to coming to a COP, maybe you do want to think about joining us in Glasgow later this year. It will be really important, again, not just for the Canadian government voice and leadership to be on the ground in Glasgow, but really vital for the Canadian business community to be there. So you know where to find me. Well, Aaron, and the Chamber know where to find me if there's any interest in learning more and also hopefully collaborating again with the Chamber as we head forward. Thank you so much.
So I hope you enjoyed our ultimate insider's guide into COP25 and COP26. We were really lucky to have Katie on the show, in terms of her expertise and firsthand knowledge of how these events actually run and what it means for the broader formation of global carbon credit markets worldwide. So I think that, please share this episode. Check out IETA if you haven't heard of them before. They're doing excellent work. And be sure to share this under COP25 or COP26, hashtag COP25, hashtag COP26, hashtag global carbon credit markets. Next week, we'll be joined by Francis Bradley, the CEO of the Canadian Electricity Association, who's going to provide us insight into how the fourth industrial revolution is changing energy distribution and generation and also retail home use in Canada. I want to thank everybody for tuning into the conversation today. And I hope you want to continue to stay engaged with us as we continue to explore the critical role Canada's resource sector plays in supporting Indigenous communities and business development, creating new technologies that are going to guide our path forward to a lower carbon economy, as well as developing practices of sustainability and innovation. And finally, just understanding the interconnected relationship and interdependencies that make the resource sector in Canada a key driver in social and economic development in small communities and large communities across Canada. And if you liked what you heard, please make sure to check out rotf.ca for new episodes and updates about the sector. If you want to continue to add support to this conversation, please feel free to share this episode on social media and maybe consider using some of these hashtags. Hashtag ROTF, hashtag Resource Champions, hashtag Canada's Natural Advantage. But we also look forward to seeing whatever you come up with as well. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to having you in the conversation in the future.